Hi, Tony Buglis again, Methodist minister, still thinking about apostles and people. And today I'm thinking about Paul. Now, I've thought about this for a while because I don't really know where to start with Paul. Some people like him, some don't. I know one person who says if there's a duck pond in heaven, when she gets there, Paul's going in. And I reckon he should be closely followed by Augustine. But let's not get into that, right? Um, what is it about Paul? Was he the one who was really the new 12th apostle? We know that Matthias was chosen, but then he sort of disappears out the scene, and Paul's the one who's nearly always at the lead, if you read in the Acts of the Apostles. That may say much more about Luke, who wrote it, but Paul really is a very important part of the story. What can we say about Paul? Well, he was clever. He tells us several times in his letters that he was a highly trained Pharisee. He trained with Gamaliel. He was, this is a bit like you or me saying, I've got a PhD from Oxford or Cambridge. Well, okay. Some of us find that a bit off-putting. You're showing off again, Paul. But those gifts, those skills, they were part of what the man was. We know at first he was dead against the Jesus movement. As far as he, as a Pharisee, was concerned, this was heresy. They were blasphemers, they were heretics. It says in Acts that he held the coats of the ones who threw the stones to kill Stephen. And then Paul, well, Saul as he was, met the risen Jesus. And that changed everything. And Saul, of course, had the wisdom, the insight, the spiritual understanding to know that you've got to take on board what God's doing for you. And he took it on board. And that made him see everything that he'd already known in a new light. It wasn't that he changed everything, he didn't jettison it, throw it all away. He said, now, how does this work now that I know that Jesus is the Son of God? He dedicated those skills to Jesus. He dedicated that knowledge to Jesus. And that changed his life. He got together with the other apostles. He listened to them. Although, again, he does like to tell us, I got this much from them, but this is what God himself showed me. Right? He got together with James, found that there were some differences between him and James, and then he traveled. And he traveled absolutely everywhere. Yes, he had rows, he made enemies. He made enemies among some of the other Christians. There were fallings out. We know there was a big dust up between him and Barnabas and between him and Mark. We know that perhaps James and Paul, well, if you put them in a room together and thrown a question in, they'd have been fighting each other before very long. There again, if you'd put James and Paul together in a room and put a pagan in, they would have been on the same side and arguing against the paganism in order to bring this person to a knowledge of Christ. So he didn't get on with all of the other Christians. He didn't get on with all of the Jews because now the one who had been so much against the Jesus movement was on their side. He changed sides. He was a traitor. That's probably why he got into so much bother when he went back to Jerusalem with the collection for the relief of the poor and was trapped and betrayed and arrested. And of course, that led to him being taken eventually to Rome because he appealed as a Roman citizen for a trial before the emperor. The important thing for us, though, is what he did, what he's left us. The stories about his travels in the Acts of the Apostles are so important, but the letters that he's left us. He wrote nearly half the New Testament. And whatever you think about the person, most of us, when we're looking for our favorite Bible quotes, will find at least some of them are there in Paul. That lovely bit in 1 Corinthians 13 about love and so on. He worked very hard to explain the faith. He brought all of those skills to bear upon the question of what it means to say that God came in Christ to reconcile the world to himself. Again, that's something that Paul said. He uses pictures drawn from the scriptures to explain to those who knew the scriptures what the scriptures really meant in being fulfilled in Jesus. But when he was explaining it to those who weren't Jews, he had to find other ways of doing it. So he used other imagery. For example, when he went to Athens, he didn't start with the synagogue there. That was what he usually did. Start with the synagogue, explain that Jesus was the Messiah. He usually split the synagogue. Those who agreed with him went with him. Those who didn't. And that was the beginnings of a church in that place. In Athens, he started off by arguing with this school of philosophers, discussing it with them, starting off with their understanding of this unknown God. Right, he said, I'm going to explain who this unknown God is. He's made himself known. Started from where they were to take them to where he wanted them to be. But all the time, of course, what Paul was doing was using popular language to explain the faith. And that's one of the interesting things. Some of the words that we think are technical theological terms, justification, redemption, all the rest of it, these were originally popular language that everybody would have understood. So redemption, that's the language of the slave market. Everybody knew about slavery. Everybody knew about having to buy people back from slavery. That was being redeemed. It made perfect sense. Justification, that's the technical term for being acquitted in a court of law. In those days, there was no telly, there was no radio, so people got their entertainment by going and watching what was happening in the courts, arguing about the cases that happened. So justification, being acquitted of the crime, acquitted of that which you're accused of, that made perfect sense. So when Jesus justifies you, that made sense. Indeed, the very word for sin, the overall umbrella term for sin, hamartia in Greek, it's borrowed from archery. It means you fall short. Your aim might be good. You knew exactly what you were aiming to do. You just didn't get there. It's archery. And that's, for most of us, what sin really means. We're not bad people. We aim well, we mean well. It just sometimes it just doesn't work. We fail, we don't get there. Yeah, it all makes sense. So lots of stuff like that from Paul is there for us to treasure. But the best thing, the most important thing, the best thing that we can take from him, I think, is his example of total dedication. If you want to follow Jesus, you've got to be dedicated to him. If you want to follow Jesus, then you've got to let Jesus take you and take you where he wants you to go. And for Paul, well, that meant all over Asia Minor, back to Palestine, back to Jerusalem, and on to Rome. And I mean, who knows? We don't actually know what happened next. As far as we know, he was martyred. But there's no story of that. There's no truth, no evidence for that. We've just got to guess. Perhaps when we get there, we'll meet and we'll find out. The important thing is, Saul became Paul. He set out on a completely new life, a life with Christ at the center, a life where Jesus led him on and led him to where he needed him to be, and used the best skills and talents that Paul had to get the word across and touch hearts. That's a pretty good example to follow, do you think?